Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah Freeman, Director of Exhibitions at the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. It's my pleasure to be your host for tonight's conversation between artists Fawn Krieger and David B. Smith and writer-curator Wendy Vogel. This event is being presented in connection with the exhibition Homebodies, which features work by Fawn and David and is on view here at the Brattleboro Museum through March 9th. You can read more about the exhibit, see installation photos, and read an excellent review of the exhibit on our website, brattleboromuseum.org. At the conclusion of tonight's conversation, there will be a Q&A, and we'll happily respond to your questions and comments at that time, rather than during the conversation. To submit a question or comment, if you're here via Zoom, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Or if you're watching on Facebook Live, just type your question there and we'll be keeping an eye on that as well. You can enter your questions or comments at any time, but we'll wait until after the conversation to get into them. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Fawn and David and Wendy to join me on screen. But before I do that, I just want to say a few words about how this exhibition came to be. And while I'm doing that, we're going to share a few installation photos so that those of you who haven't seen the exhibit in person will have some visual frame of reference. David B. Smith and Fawn Krieger are artists both working with materials that are traditionally grounded in the realm of craft and/or domesticity, textiles and ceramics. This exhibition was conceived in a global viral pandemic, during which the concept and context of the home and domestic space became a site for reinvention. Confined largely to our living spaces, many of us felt physically and emotionally isolated, and the home became as much a site of entrapment as one of refuge. As time has passed, since the show went up in October, I've noticed new things when I go into the galleries, new things about the work. I notice now I have a feeling of being held in the space, and for me, the formal aspects of the work reflect that holding and give me additional space to think about, for example, safety and what that means. I think about a hierarchy of needs, about emotional safety, and I mean, so many things, making meaning, layers, and I'm excited to dig into those things this evening. I'd like to ask Fawn, David, and Wendy to join me on screen. So they can reveal themselves. Hey, hello everyone.
Hi,
it's great to see all of you. So now I'm going to turn off my mic and my video, and I'll just come back when it's time to have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Vogel, and I am a writer, an art critic, a faculty member at Parsons School of Design, and an occasional independent curator, although not the curator of the show. That is the honor of Sarah, who we just heard from. I just wanted to thank the Brattleboro Museum for inviting me to moderate this conversation, and especially to Fawn and David. So Fawn and David and I have all known each other for, I think, over a decade through mutual friends in New York. But over the course of, it's been close to 7 months since I received this invitation to moderate this conversation. I've gotten to know their practices much more deeply, and for that, I am extremely grateful. And I just want to thank you both for inviting me. So in terms of my work, I publish very frequently about art and culture and feminist issues, and a lot of my work is concerned with questions that center around the stakes of feminism, which include how personal history informs art, conventions of gendered labor, and the question of value in art. In other words, who becomes a part of art history, and how is their work perceived based on categories like gender, race, class, etc. So over the course of this evening, I would love to engage Fawn and David in some of these questions, among others. And to keep it brief, so that we have time to talk. I'm going to turn it over now to Fawn first.
Sure, I can talk first.
Great.
Okay, let me share my screen. And then I'm going to make this full size. Okay. So my name is Fawn Krieger. I am an artist, an educator, and an arts administrator. And my work is situated between the conceptual, the somatic, the material, and the ritual. For the past 4 years, I've been gathering and attaching fired clay and concrete in almost kind of like a bricklaying form, but sort of wildly. And I've been documenting the event of these material collisions. And in so doing, I'm imagining the work as situated somewhere between art and artifact. The series of work that I'm showing at the Brattleboro Museum in Homebodies falls under the title caesura. Caesura is a pause or a break, typically used to describe a pause or break in language or music, but it's typically referenced as a symbol. It's these sort of two double lines. And I'm really interested in how symbols can be used interchangeably with letters and words, and in particular this one because it's two autonomous bodies that form a whole. And that sort of corresponds with my thoughts around fusing clay and concrete together. So in addition to looking at geological and temporal conditions, I'm also really interested in like visual vocabularies that seem to try to describe immeasurable things through some measurements. So these are wayfinding tools for archaeologists and sort of harken back to the visuals of the first work that I showed you. All of the work at the museum are these discrete works which are sort of like collections of patterns, almost like families or clanships, villages. And some of the more recent pieces, this and the next two are from late 2023. You can see there's more sort of a reference to symbol or pictorial and linguistic coming together. I often think about this term, the rebus, which is the phenomenon where pictures became written language. I'm interested in that history and how it sort of shaped the arc of like human thinking and communication and collectivity or lack thereof. So a little bit about like sort of my material thinking. I think about clay as a record keeper of like our human story and movement. This is a photograph of 3.5 million year old footprints, hominin footprints in what is today Tanzania. This is a Neolithic, so around 5,000 to 6,000 year old clay vessel from the Baltics. And this is a ceramic tiled heat shield on a space shuttle. So sort of like all different references for movement, migration. And likewise, I think about concrete as this material which holds us to place, both in terms of occupation, but also in terms of finding place. So concrete is processed from a number of materials, primarily, or the one prominent one is from limestone, which is what constitutes our most, meaningful caves that record our earliest human story. But I'm also thinking about concrete as a history of labor, occupation, settlement, revolution. This is a 1925 illustration from the Soviet Union. Concrete as a material of power. These are the concrete cooling towers of the nuclear facility at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. And concrete as a material of war. This is a crushed bunker that is underneath a mountain in central Berlin, Germany. And one of many, many photographs from a research project that I did that spanned about 15 years looking at mountains of rubble throughout Germany.
Wow. I haven't seen that in Berlin. I have to talk to you about where that is.
I can tell you where it is.
Cool. Well, that was great. I learned a lot about your work and both of your works. So look forward to talking more. But I'm gonna do a little like kind of just random slideshow of my work, and then I'm gonna just read something that I wrote in the last couple of days about just how I'm thinking about who I am and how that relates to my art practice. All right. Hi, my name is David B. Smith. I live in Lenape-Hoking, otherwise known as Brooklyn. I'm a queer third-generation immigrant of Ashkenazic descent. I am part of an ancestral line of makers, caretakers, and survivors. My mom's grandmother sewed clothing in a sweatshop in the Lower East Side. Her husband was blacklisted for organizing upholstery workers in the same neighborhood. My mom's mother played piano in nursing homes and taught me to craft. Her husband served in World War II and held frugality as a virtue in the face of scarcity. My dad's mother created menorahs and needlepoints that adorn our home. Her husband was a textile designer who owned a fabric business. I inherited his extensive tie collection. My mother is a writer, dancer, musician, and cancer survivor. My father is a curator and collector of art. Me and my sister now own and are inspired by his mostly obscure contemporary art collection. I think this is going faster than I thought it would, the images. I might go through twice. I am part of a thriving and diverse community of artists, musicians, crafters, thinkers, writers, theater makers, therapists, lawyers, and chosen family of various backgrounds, cultures, and ways of living. I see myself as part of a tapestry of people, environments, and systems. We all make our lives together. We make them with and between each other. I see my art, I stop it there, yeah. I see my art as a practice of that, a way to share emotions and ideas that I experience and notice around me to anyone, regardless of language or culture. I use photography, software, textiles, installation, sound, sculpture, and performance to make environments and objects to invite dialogue around sustainable, empowered, and loving ways of being. I speak with my body, with what I make, not through capitalistic, goal-oriented, or extractive methodologies, but through a desire to share, connect, play, build, and unbuild together, from our bodies to our homes and in between. Different style.
That's beautiful, David.
That was really beautiful.
Oh,
Thank
wow.
you. All right. So I'm going to kick it off with some questions, which I've sent to the artists in advance. And my first question, Sarah gave us a lovely introduction to homebodies, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the process of putting the show together in the words of you both, of the sort of give and take, the back and forth over the timeline of putting the show together. And yeah, I'm curious about whether you were making work and sending it to each other, and if there was like a free flowing exchange of ideas, if you might have even been connecting in a third space, material investigation. I'll turn it over to both of you to answer it however you see fit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Well, I'll just jump in, but yeah, I mean, we came up with the title kind of like maybe halfway through the process or something. It wasn't really guiding the process. It was more a reflection on some of the themes that were coming through. but I mean, yeah, the process was, I think one of the interesting things about the process for me, because we have, you know, limited time, I won't, it was a very rich process, but was that I've never done a two-person show before. And I was very like, kind of like taken aback. I was like, what is a two-person show supposed to mean? Is that about, I mean, we've all heard of a one-person show, we've heard of a group show, but like a two-person show, it has like an implication. It's like a dyad. It's like, is it about making a show together about something else, or is it I mean, how, like, there's so many ways you could relate to artists' work, and I think Fawn and I had kind of differing, or like, you know, we didn't just fall into a pattern. It was more about the conversation about how we wanted to relate, which I think is kind of telling in a way, because both of our works is about sort of about the way objects relate to each other. And so I think I learned that you know, I would say to Fawn, what are we going to do? What is this show going to look like? Like, where are we going to make like a library? Are we going to make like some kind of carnival in here? And Fawn was like, why don't you just do what you do your thing, and I'll do my thing, and then we'll like stay in touch. And I was like, oh, that sounds different for me, because I'm like a very hands-on, like, let's talk it out. But it was kind of amazing because it just gave me this license to go deep into my own practice and then have faith that our work would connect later.
But we were like also in regular dialogue too. So there was like a sort of emotional, psychological exchange that we were like, and having each other over to our studios. I remember this time I was at the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation residency at the end of 2022, and it's in Connecticut, and there's this like amazing flea market around there called Mongers. And so I went there, and like there was this little like crocheted sign or something, and it said household. And I sent you a photograph, David, of that. And I was like, is this our title? And you were like, almost, like, and then you came back with Homebodies, and we were both like, that's it. So yeah, I think things started to coalesce too when we found our title.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so my next question, Fawn, you already began to address this really beautifully in your self-introduction, but I'm curious about the ways multiple forms, or let's say registers of meaning, come together in your practice. So in Fawn's work, I'm thinking about the relationship between language and sculpture, but in David's work, I'm thinking about the joining together of photography and textiles. So I'm curious about the way that your work bridges various forms. And Fawn, if you feel like the language and sculpture conversation is spent, then maybe you could spin that into different ways of working with your materials.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's not the first thing that came to me, like when we were just sharing different ideas. Like what actually came to me was like that meaning making for me happens in the making, like that it's through the work becoming that it's where its meaning is generated. And so it's time and place, the pressures and actions and events, both human and environmental, that form its shape, and temporal, that can't ever be reproduced. So the work becomes not just an artwork, but a record of like an irreplaceable moment. And in that, a record of what it meant to live in that moment. And I think for me, like, work really my own work and other people's work like really functions at the highest vibration for me, like when the work is it could be about other things, but centrally it's about its own becoming. So I guess that's where I went with like meaning making. I mean, of course, that comes from many places and, you know, but that's the most central one for me.
Yeah.
Like a ritual embodiment or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and like an archive, like an archive of an action and a time, or the convergence of an action, a person, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a big crossover between Fawn and my work, is kind of the idea of like the archive and the like way that's kind of what I meant about the relationship between objects. And it's like an archive can tell a story of like some kind of subject matter, but it's like, how do you arrange that material and how do you play with the arrangement of that material? And like in my work, I use photography, which is kind of very rich for me in the sense that it captures a way of seeing, or like it's almost like letting somebody see what I see, and then I output that onto textiles, usually through jacquard weaving, which is a computerized weaving tool, or printing, and then sort of manipulate, like physically craft the textiles by hand to like sort of talk about how the content within the original image can kind of change meaning through this like physical manipulation and intervention. And to me, that speaks a lot about like the past, about memory, about how we may be defined by stories from the past through archives, through history writing, but that those stories can be taken and looked at from different angles and sort of pulled apart, and sort of it's important for my work for me to point out that the way you tell the story is just as is actually quite important, because like, for example, a photograph of something could tell one story, but if you look at it in a different way, you could tell a different story. And so it's sort of about the pliability of truth, and sort of the way that also the way that we can like deconstruct images to create space for new truths and new like possibilities. I don't know if that resonates with you, Fawn, or not, but
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of like uh what is the word? It's like almost collage, but through ideas and resources, like all different ways of thinking about collage beyond material.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there is like this distinction between like the things that we're interested in or we research versus the things that like ultimately get imbued in the work, you know. And sometimes they come through, but sometimes I find like my research is like years behind what actually like physically emerges in the work in a way. Like it has to get metabolized, and it's the metabolizing that really is like the meaning engine.
Yeah, I often use the word like composting in my work. Like it's like you feed the material in, and then it sort of starts to like break down, and in the similar way, I mean, as eating or metabolizing, it's like it starts to kind of get broken into smaller parts, then the parts get like rearranged, and then new things can grow in the resulting sort of collage, as you put it. I feel like collage is, we need more words around the word collage to explain, because that's just such a
What about decoupage? I always want to bring that word back.
yeah, that's
Like some Victorian lady, like
Right. That's scrapbooking, right? Decoupage.
decoupage is like that thing where you take like, you know, like old like Gibson girl drawings and stuff, and then you put them on like, you know, like a jewelry box, and then you put acrylic gel medium over it.
Okay.
like 3D collage, sort of, maybe.
it's actually more the opposite, where you're creating this uniformity of like from different pictures. But I think it's like a Victorian era, like teenage pastime, kind of like maybe, I don't know, like the TikTok of like
Right,
early
right.
20th century.
I was thinking of that show at the Met wasn't there a show at the Met a couple of years ago of
Yes.
some of these objects, and then also some of the books that it was all like Victorian teenage girls and
Yes.
women. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
and it-
Somewhere between like wallpaper, like shelf paper and
like a teenage bedroom like poster, like
yeah.
But it is like, I guess decoupage is actually kind of interesting to think about, because it is like a parts to whole. It's like taking parts and making them whole. And that is like also actually maybe we need to just work with that word as our.
I mean, there's also a lot with like science around how everything is made of, systems, and you can break systems down to smaller parts and small, and like everything we see is just sort of, it seems like a finalized object, but it's actually just a sort of a overlay of infinite amounts of like materials that are all organized into like so I kind of think, and also conceptually and idea wise, which I think you're going to ask a question later about patterning, which
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Like where decoupage meets cybernetics, is cybernetics also referring to the systems within systems?
Isn't that Ella Hubbard's book?
I don't
Wait,
know about
is that
that.
cybernet? Is that like, I feel like that's something like that, no?
It's like like a Ron Hubbard book, but could be just
Maybe
No, that's
decoupage.
Dianetics.
Oh, that's what it is.
cybernetics.
Well,
Okay.
this is turning into like really entertaining.
Uh,
I think like maybe for me, it's like decoupage and quantum mechanics combined.
Yeah, that's more what I'm thinking. Quantum mechanics, string
Yeah.
theory.
Yeah. Like the multiverse and
Yeah,
decoupage.
multi-coupage. Yeah, verse. Yeah.
all these new exhibition title possibilities emerging from this conversation. Yeah, so I think that you both touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious about, so my next question is about play and material transgression and materials doing what they're not supposed to do in your practice. So I'm curious, I mean, David, you mentioned this very explicitly, the role of play in your work, and Fawn, you did as well, thinking about even the object as an archive or like a record for what happened in the making of it. And this is also like a two-part question. The second part of the question is, how do you set and break rules for yourselves as artists, which is my creative independent hat, you know? Do you know that website, The Creative Independent?
Yeah. I think I know the instrument.
Yeah. Anyway, that's the kind of question that they would ask, is how do you set and break rules for yourself as an artist?
That's a good question. Well,
Can I start with that one? I feel like they're two
Yeah.
totally different
They
questions.
are.
I would say that like my number one rule is that to pay a lot of attention to fear, and to not let it control me, and to know when to walk towards it and when to walk away from it, and like to be able to distinguish those. And I often see like fear as a real creative tool for transformation and evolution as an artist, like not just making things, but also like identity, like everything. And so that's like sort of my number one rule, is like having the courage to walk towards fear, but also the like ability to discern what kind of fear it is and what's driving it.
How do you discern what kind of fear it is?
I think it's like actually like a body conversation. Um, and if the fear feels like something's wrong, you know, that feels different in your body than like if it feels like I'm scared to do this. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, or I'm afraid I'll find out something I don't want. You know, all of these things that like fear, and there's a distinction there. So if it's a kind of threat around like actual danger, you know, like I'm using a tool wrong or something, that kind of fear feels very different in my body than like doubt or insecurity or some relationship with, you know, the fiction of failure. So
Yeah, I love that. And I love, you know, collaborating with Fawn and talking with her because she kind of leans into that space of where there might be a little danger, and it makes me feel more brave to do it myself in my practice. And um it's great to collaborate with you. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think again, like, we have totally different ways of doing it, but my work is a lot about fear as well, like fear of difference, fear of the unexpected, of the uncertain, um, and I often put myself into that place in my work, and I kind of almost like freak myself out sometimes. I'm like, I don't know if what I'm doing is going to work. I don't know what is going to happen. I walk down that path of uncertainty, and I ask my you know, community to, when they engage with the work, to walk that path with me and sit in that place of discomfort, um, and just kind of just sit with it and notice the feeling of discomfort in your body, and notice that nothing bad is actually happening, to notice that um, there are all different types of cultures and people in our world, and just because something is different or unexpected or surprising, it doesn't mean it's going to hurt you, you know. And so like I like to think also about my work as a place to experiment with doing things wrong, like make intentionally doing things wrong, because that might end up becoming uh, a creative pathway, and if I develop those practices in my artwork, I can then utilize those skills in the real world to like invent new ways of living, of like relating to, of you know, communicating. And so yeah, it's so funny though, because my work's like soft and fun, colorful, and I mean it's fun, so it's Fawn's, but Fawn's is more like kind of hard and heavy, and so it's very different, but also at the root the same, you know.
Anything you want to add about play? You're right that they were two different questions, but maybe starting with you, Fawn, the role of play.
yeah. Well, I had this like epiphany when I was in graduate school, that I still return to like periodically, which is that like um play in my work for me is like a certain kind of fantasy space around utopia, or like imagining utopia, which is more compelling to me than like actually a utopia. Like the construction of one. But the epiphany was that I realized like, because I made a lot of art as a kid, but like my artistic making as an adult actually doesn't feel like its ancestry is in making art, the art that I made as a kid. The ancestry line feels more connected to my dollhouse relationship and like playing with the dollhouse, making dollhouse food, which was like a huge thing. But like the imagining of a whole world, um and um I guess, I mean, there's a lot I could say here, but simply put, like, I have sort as an artist, I've had sort of like two tracks of working. Like David, I work a lot collaboratively, and I work also independently on discrete works in my studio. But the collaborative work that I have historically done is working with performers and building sets and props and things like costumes and stuff. So um, I am like actively always thinking about ritual and performance and movement as both body movement, but also as like social movement and co-authorship and like making a world together. And so all of these things are sort of interconnected, I guess, but um, I would say simply that I think about play as like the possibility of building a world. And so like my sculpture, even though I would call it like cat size or something, they actually kind of, I can imagine them like huge or scaled up, or like mini. And so there is sort of something about scale that's related to all of this.
Yeah, yeah, and I echo that with like the idea of like theater, creating a place for people to play, to feel like they're in another, another world, maybe that's not their everyday world, and sort of like creating props. Or I also we're talking, with like interactivity, and I invite people to play, literally play, to move things around, to turn on switches and off switches and lights, and to compose themselves in the space in the spirit of experimenting. Like when I hear the word play, I think experimentation. And an experiment, I think I just read this somewhere, is like an adventure, but you don't know where you're going. And so like I like to do that in my work, where I'm like, I don't know where this is going, but I wanna find out. And to me, that's feels like playing.
I want to add something here because I think David, what you just said made me think about it, and I sort of touched upon it earlier, but like only through insinuation, which I think maybe the question of play also relates to like how do you orient yourself to like failure or like an idea of failure, and like what are the stakes. And I love the radicality of like just not just being totally punk. Like there's no such thing as like establish, like I create the value. I decide what, what is beautiful, or like that beauty is even a thing or a value, like that that there is no such thing as failure, and there is no such thing between the product or the rehearsal, like that, like the terms of the agency of what can exist is like all possible, and refuses like um value systems that uh minimize agency and independence. And like, so yeah, I think like play is actually like, even though it's like suggestive of a light or frivolous kind of thing, it's actually like the highest stakes in a way. Like where does risk come in? How do you perceive it? I mean, I don't mean to ask the questions, but like these are the things that come up for me. And like in terms of like play is like actually really serious, and is about like sort of shedding external value systems and like reassigning um what like what the idea of failure is.
Yeah, such a relief when you can take failure out of the off the table. For
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, and really failure is control. Like that's where there's failure, like it's like um yeah. So like in play there's like this this possibility for improvisation and not knowing, but also unknowing, or like relearning, practice, rehearsal, negotiation, surrender.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, in a space of like, I mean, that's where you get to when you like walk into your fear too, right? Which is what you were talking about before.
I think like something that gets often misunderstood with artists is that it's like really hard to be an artist. Like it's, and as it is for a writer, I mean, I sort of see us in like artists in a large um term, um creative makers. It's like it takes a lot of courage and a persistence to not get comfortable and to repeatedly walk towards um not knowing and all the things that come with it: doubt, confusion, fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like the process every time. Every time, if you're not like in the middle of it, where you have this moment where you're like, I don't know where this is going. Was this such a good idea to me? Like, it's not going to be something that's worth it in the end if I don't have that moment in the middle of like, what is happening.
Yeah.
Have you ever read Bird by Bird? I just assigned it to my students this past week.
Ooh, no.
It's a book by Anne Lamott. It's her book about, it's her writing instruction book. But I mean, I relate to it so deeply because she also talks about like all of the hangups and perfectionism. And she has this amazing metaphor at the top of the chapter about perfectionism where she had gotten her tonsils removed, and a week after her tonsils were removed, she still had this terrible pain in her throat. It was hurting every time she swallowed. She called the doctor and said, I need another round of painkillers. And could you throw something fun in there while you're at it? And the doctor said, and the nurse on the line said, I'm not going to give you any more painkillers. What you're going to do instead is you're going to chew gum. And she said, what? Are you kidding me? Like, I can't do that. I can't chew gum. I told you it hurts so badly when I swallow. And she said, what happens when you have a surgery like this is your body is fearing further invasion. And so all of the muscles around your tongue and your throat, or well, in your throat, like seize up. And so the only way to get through it is through like this exercise, this like just this going through the paces and like, you know, ripping off the Band-Aid essentially, experiencing that like momentary discomfort for ultimately like a quick relief of pain and like a longer relief of pain and like a more holistic relief from pain. And, you know, this is her metaphor of like, how do you face the blank page with some sense of, you know, I don't know, trusting or like just.
I think to me, it
Yeah.
makes me think of like, you know, we want to trust our bodies. We want to think that our bodies know what's right for us, but sometimes our bodies give us signals that aren't right. And, you know, like we need to use sometimes kind of like expand our imagination and resources to like learn that we may not want to just always do what feels right, you know, because we can get into these, yeah, and then when, and knowing when to trust and when not to trust, and sort of exploring that as a range of space of that you can test different theories with. Yeah, because I don't know, it just makes me think. I did a craniosacral therapy today, and it was the first time, and I was actually experiencing a lot of what you were saying, because it was in this kind of like this feeling of like, is it safe to let go? You know, is it safe? Is it safe to not hold tight? And yeah, just sitting in that space for a while, and it was good. I would do it again, but also just, now I can kind of remember back to that experience. And if I didn't do that, I wouldn't. So we kind of have to like repattern ourselves sometimes. I feel.
Good for you that you're doing craniosacral. It's like my favorite thing.
Oh, cool. A lot of people I know and really like are doing it. So I'll talk more about it with you.
Never tried it. You'll have
Yeah.
to tell me more about it
Yeah.
outside of this conversation. So it's 7:45. I propose maybe one or two more questions and then open it up to Q&A. I see we have one question in Q&A, but there may be more. Okay, so I'm going to start with the pattern question because I think it's an important one in relationship to both of your works. So both of you make work that's engaged with patterning and calls to mind different forms of creative products, from handmade crafts traditionally made by women or were called women's work, to technical and industrial products. So I'm curious about how you think about pattern and labor in your work, and also the relationship between labor and gender.
That's a great question. It's a hard one to kind of like speak to off the top of my head, but do you want to go, or I can, I'm talking. Like, yeah, there's so much there. Like, first of all, like, I love thinking about expectations of labor and the types of labor different genders people are, or different are expected to do. And I, having, being a cisgendered male who um, dates various people, not male identifying people, find myself in our culture as like somebody who people don't expect would work with textiles. I've often come across situations where people see my work and they'll literally say, "Oh, I just assumed a woman made that," or they would say, "Oh, wait, you know how to sew? Like, how do you know how to sew?" I'm like, and even though it just seems so like, old school, or maybe whatever, it's fifth, but so I do like to think about, like, just, this is tackling one part of your question, which is I do really think about the modes of production. So I like to combine both the technical or machine industrial method of production that is not made with the human body, but is instead made with a machine. Um, a lot of machines, including the internet, were developed by men who, were very focused on the intellect, on precision, on information, data, and organization, but didn't really take into account like the body at all. And so what I am interested in there is that I sort of get this mass-produced industrial product like a jacquard weaving, and then I bring it to the studio and I start to cut it up, like intervene with embroidery, add stuff it, and sort of like create this hybrid result, which is somewhere between technical and bodily. And my goal with that is to try to speak to a range of an experimentation of possibility of gender, not to think of gender as binary or even limited to any number of genders, but instead to be all about a relationship between various characteristics, various ways of being, various ways of presenting, that can all be layered and integrated into one quote unquote piece or body. And even amongst bodies, even I'm also interested in, like, I don't know if it's post-humanism or whatever, but like just kind of like how we create identities and gender structures through our relationships with each other, and how we don't have to be defined finitely within our body. So it's kind of about, yeah, blurring and blending and creating new ways to be. So
I love that.
oh, yay. I'm always like, does it make sense? Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, totally. It's like really your work. Okay, so like I mean, I guess I have like a couple of answers to thinking about like pattern and labor and gender and the confluence. I mean, one thing that I'll say about pattern is I think a lot about pattern in relation to social pattern more than like visual patterns, but like even when I think about like a visual pattern, I'm like interested in like how it can skew the perception of a volumetric form so that there's like a distortion of the volume, but I'm like interested in that like as a psychological event, like more than a sort of like picture or something. Like I'm interested in the idea of like what happens when we don't understand like or we have two different understandings of like a volume and like how does what is possible when we misinterpret through perception, and like that becomes sort of like more symbolic or like a larger question. And so like that is like sort of maybe like a example of how I think about pattern. And then you know, like I'm using a material, a clay, which is like historically primarily a domestic material with some industrial uses. And then concrete, which is a very industrial material with a lot of war uses um mechanical, you know, like very industrial uses. So, but like I think sort of in a basic way um about them also with like a history of gender, like who worked with these materials and how are they processed or refined, whose hands were touching them, and what did those materials then record in terms of the somatic memory that they hold, the imprint. And like I'm interested in what happens when like a domestic cue is combined with like an industrial war cue, and I'm thinking about that in like ways like um how do we bring war into the home? Like, for example, like atomic era, you know, design fetishes, you know, like international style, but it actually comes from like really horrible soft power politics and like this sort of coveting of a style that has all that baggage. Like that's really interesting to me. Um, so like, but also sort of in a larger way, how do we bring war into the home? How does it become like, how, where does like weaponization start? And then vice versa, like what does it mean to like export domestic values? And like, how do we internalize violence and like brutality? And I'm sort of interested in this. And also what is the possibility, like if I can explore that, what is the possibility of shifting that paradigm or like generating like a power dynamic between these two that like reconciles them or produces something with possibility or connection. So that's one thing. And I think like another way that I think about gender in my work is in relation to body memory and like witness and performing and ritual and reflection and proof of existence. Like and how and like I'm really drawn to materials that like record and can show me my body, like what my body knows, and like can represent that and in a way kind of validate my existence and like my set of experiences. And you know, and that comes from like inherited systems of silencing, but also in like coming to know through like language, like a gendered language, and coming to see like the act of seeing. So Yeah, so that's like maybe another way, maybe a slipperier way to like sort of identify gender, but I think like a really important one that's prominent in my work.
I don't know if we have time for another question, but maybe not. But if not, then I could say one more thing about patterns. But
Yeah, go for it. I think I'd rather let's hear from you and feel like you've gotten what you want to say, and then we can turn to the Q&A. And if there are very few questions in the Q&A, we can also come back to some stuff too.
I was thinking one question was for the Q&A, we could talk about the title of the show, because we talked about how much we liked the title, but we didn't say anything about it really. I mean, it kind of came out through all this conversation. But yeah, I guess I was thinking about, I'm very interested in the way we think, the way that our thoughts are like patterns. I I also, my grandfather was a textile designer, and he created patterns. And I kind of think patterns often often get this kind of attitude that that they're sort of just decoration on the surface of something. They're just kind of like some lines and flowers, but actually, even within the most simple pattern, there's meaning, there's a story, and there's sort of a story beneath the surface. So in a way, I'm interested in how we can start to see the patterns in our own unconscious. We can start to talk about the patterns that we're acting according to, but that we don't know that we're acting according to. We just assume them as the way things are supposed to be. Oh, this is how you do this, or this is how one becomes successful, or this is how one raises a family, or this is how one dies, or this is how, all of these ways of being in the world have kind of a code, like a hidden code of meaning, kind of matrix style, sort of floating, and we're kind of like following it to the T, but we don't know we're following it. So like I guess my thing with patterns is that we all can kind of like maybe take a step back and say, well, what patterns do I agree with, and what patterns do I disagree with? How are these patterns playing out in my body, in my mind? I'm a big meditator myself, and also studying Gestalt therapy now, and I'm just really feeling like awareness of what's happening, and practices of awareness are kind of the first step to even know what's happening, because we can intellectualize and we can work with concepts and theories, but to actually see reality for what it is requires a certain kind of practice of slowing down, of training your perceptions to notice nuance and subtlety, and not to impose like fabricated narratives onto a situation. So for me, pattern, when you first asked that question, I was like, oh, pattern, what is that, like a grid or something? But then like I realized it's like everything, it's like pattern is an image, pattern is music, pattern is like a tree, it's like the way we tell a story. It's
the tides, all these nature things too.
Yeah, these nature things, and it's like, yeah, it's like that organizing principle of what, yeah, like I've when you start to look into like I guess cellular biology and stuff, and learn how there are these just very amazing magical ways that things arrange themselves, and you kind of got to look close to and like kind of look with curiosity at the world and to notice all these patterns. And speaking of, I love your shirt, Fawn. Yeah.
Yeah. Sarah, are there any other questions in the chat that we should be turning our attention to?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but I do. We have a question here. Well, first, before we get into questions, there's a lovely comment here from Laura Petrovich Cheney, who says, "Congratulations on your exhibit. I look forward to seeing the work in person. David, it's so nice to hear you talk about your work. I have seen it when you first started, and the progression is phenomenal." That's nice. Nice comment from Laura. And earlier in the talk, Kira asked a question about process and said that they would love to hear more about the artistic process of both Fawn and David. And David, I think you talked a little bit about how the photography works within the kind of moves it through the textiles. But I wonder, Fawn, if you could talk a little bit more in detail about how you make your work.
Yeah, so I make ceramic forms. I usually use hand building tech. I usually use a slab hand building technique, but more often I've been making molds, plaster molds, and then using porcelain slip to cast. So I'm making lots of volumetric forms. And then I will underglaze and or glaze them. And fire them. So I'm never applying like paint after they've been fired. The glaze is part of the material. I mean, the color is part of the material. And then after they get out of the kiln, sometimes they'll stay around my studio for a while. And I'll start thinking through compositions and what I want to do. Sometimes it's related to, like I talked about, pattern in relation to perception. Sometimes it's related to thinking about building, like architectural history or the void or a rupture. Those are sort of some starting points. And then I'll have like sort of a loose idea of a composition, and then I will prepare concrete. I have to sort of get masked up, and it's kind of a process. It's a somewhat violent material in its like process. And I should say also I set up a video camera and lighting because I'm really interested in studying like my body pressure and the interaction of the materials like after the fact. So I have like a large video archive of like all of these, but and then I sometimes add pigment to the concrete, dry concrete pigment, and then I'll start to sort of combine things, but invariably, like things don't fit the way they do. And then there's like an emergency and like the concrete spilling and like dying stuff. And I have to like reconfigure a plan. And sometimes it's an absolute mess and disaster and requires like a lot of improvisation and like walking towards fear and doubt and the concrete only has about like 20 minutes till it dries, and I would say actually the first 10 minutes it's too liquidy sort of, so there's really only like a solid 10 to 15 minutes that like it can hold itself. So it's a really sort of time sensitive moment, and then I let the work fully solidify. And yeah, then sometimes I'll go back into it later with more on top, and sometimes it's complete as is. But I try to like accept whatever happens with each of them as like a document of that event. I may not like one or two or whatever, but like it's still a document of like a phenomenon that happened.
That's so clear in my mind that just like I created an image of you just like doing that is amazing. Yeah.
Do you
I guess
imagine
I didn't
that?
realize how kind of frantic it could be. That's really interesting.
I feel like it's kind of intense. And every time
Yeah.
I start on the concrete part, I'm like, I'm never working with concrete again. But I just love it. It's also like it brings up so much emotion, and like there's something about it creates a kind of urgency and self-reliance, and calls upon instinct in such an immense way that like it's also really a gift. But there's a lot of threat in the material, even in small amounts. So it also burns your hands, like because it's an extreme base, so you can't get it in your eyes. It will burn your hands if you touch it for more than a couple minutes. So you have to wear like a lot of protection.
Oh my God. David, I'm kind of curious about some of the work that's in the show now. You're really playing a lot with transparency in a way that I don't really see as much in some of the earlier work. And I'm kind of curious about how that came to be and kind of how you think about that idea of transparency in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a nice question because it kind of dovetails with what Fawn was just talking about, because a lot of my work has this kind of obsessive or like overworked quality, where it's like Fawn has 10 minutes to make a work, I'll take 6 months to make a work. And the question is like, what else can I do to this? Like, what else, how can I add more to this? Like, I want it to be so dense that it's like kind of like just you'll never see everything, like, and there is a piece like that kind of, or a couple pieces like that in the show too. But there was kind of a transitional moment that kind of came about, I would say, right before we started making this show, where I just said to myself, like, well, I'm kind of interested in this, like, how much can I fit into per square inch, or like how much energy, how many choices can I fit in? Because I feel like when I first got into textiles and embroidery, I thought, well, I want something that will it's in a similar way to Fawn. It's like I want something that will record all my choices, but I want to make a lot of choices. Like I want to make like thousands of choices, and then all of them to be, but then I thought, well, that's getting kind of heavy. That's getting kind of overbearing. It's actually like painful to make it on my body. It's painful to look at, because it's just so much stimulation. So I just thought, let me go the other direction and do like a 180 and see if I can make work about space and about light and about openness. Because actually, psychologically, I was going through a phase of welcoming lightness, of welcoming openness, of welcoming transparency into my own life. And I see my work as a tool to like help me to be the way I want to be in my life. So, and like I was also interested in moving works, and I thought, well, like, and I'm very fascinated by like depth as well, and like creating three-dimensional forms out of two-dimensional forms. And if you take a curtain and you put holes in it, and then you put something behind it, immediately you're creating this kind of form that's both surface and space and sculpture, and kind of has these like these like tunnels that kind of move from front to back. And I made these panels, these large panels, that had translucent cutouts in them, and I hung them all like stacked, like one here, then like one behind it, and another one behind it, in front of a large window, and with the idea that the piece would be illuminated with the light from behind, the light from the front, but also the viewer could hold the curtain and move it, and change the composition, and not only the contour of the composition, but actually the internal panels would reveal new compositions. So like, that's, I just sometimes you do something for a while, and you just gotta like expand, you know.
Nice. That's actually a perfect lead in. We have a great question from Sarah, and Sarah says, "Thank you both. I'm curious to hear about molded and or stuffed forms in your work. Are surface and interiority concepts that are meaningful to you?"
Oh, yeah. Well, molded, I don't know. I don't really work with molded, meaning like I don't like
Yeah.
although I've thought about like upholstery kind of as molded because it's like you're wrapping an existing shape or something. But yeah, I mean, I think about like kind of like what Fawn was saying about how a pattern on a three-dimensional form sort of starts to create this like idea of you know, like infinite amounts to see ways of seeing something. Because if you look at it in one direction, it looks one way, and you look another and it looks the other way. So, and I'm also really interested in how the image lays on the surface, and then how the surface kind of undulates and um, can kind of speak to an emotional quality within the image and kind of have this dialogue between form and surface. Um, that's definitely, you know, it goes exactly into what I was saying about two-dimensional versus three-dimensional. There was one word you used that was like, I forget, but it was about, it seemed to me to bring up the idea of like a body, I guess, and contour or something. Like I guess I think of, I do like to make works that are suggestive of sort of alien bodies. Because for me, like, we have all these assumptions about what a body is, but if there was another parallel dimension, a body could look so unusual to us that we wouldn't even recognize it as a body. So like, it's kind of my gesture of making soft sculptures is sometimes like, you know, giving a pattern presence and space, and sort of, it's almost like a spirit, like it takes on a character of a being when you stuff something. I don't know if you've ever, like, my first time sewing period was in the Boy Scouts or the Cub Scouts, and I was like 12 years old or 10 or something, and it was how to make a bean bag. That was the class, and we got a little pieces of fabric, we put beans inside and we sewed them, and like, I still, that was my favorite badge by far. And to
Did
me,
you make a hamburger? Is that what you guys made?
no, just a maybe I thought it was square, but maybe a square hamburger, I guess. But there's just, I don't know, like, about like filling something, and it like, and then you just want to hug it, you know, and it's like you want to play with it. It's like, I love soft sculpture and like pillows and, you know, upholstery, and there's something magical because it's like, yeah, bodily about it.
And Fawn, I want to make sure you have a chance to respond to that as well. The interiority question within your molded forms,
Yeah.
and kind of what's starting to happen now with your work.
Yeah, I mean, there is a literal interiority in the sense of like a lot of the forms are cast. And so like in the way that like a ceramic figurine has that hole at the bottom because it's also been cast, like the back, or what is called the back of the sculpture, is like also has like little empty spaces like that. But I mean, or what could be called empty spaces, but um I'd like to propose like another thought too, which is like, I mean, I think a lot about like what it means to work with clay, and that clay has historically been a vessel. And so like I do think about my sculptures as vessels, even though they're not like literally like a basket that can hold grain. They are like, I do think about like symbolic interiority in terms of like conceptual ancestry within the work. And there are times, more practically speaking, that I invert the forms and like think more explicitly, like for audiences about, or show the audience like the void space, and like explore that in relation to like something that appears volumetrically closed. Yeah.
I love that. I kind of love what you said, Sarah, at the beginning about being held,
Hmm.
and the idea
Yeah.
of a a feeling of holding the clay, and textiles can have. Um,
Yeah, it's a good feeling, I have to say. I've been appreciating it a lot. There's another really good question that we've got here from John. John says, you've both offered some very thoughtful and thought-provoking insights that might not be apparent to the viewer without being able to engage in a context like this discussion.
oh,
How important to you is it that a viewer gets whatever is deeper for you about your work?
good question. Yeah.
Always good question. I'll take a stab because I feel like David has been going first a lot, even though I'm not prepared.
It's not a judgment that I go.
But I feel like that's sort of the casualty of like artists putting work out in the world, like, and that's why institutions are so important and distinctly different than what happens in commercial galleries, like, and that to support them means that you're supporting a learning process of seeing an artist fully, not just through like the trace of what the physical trace of their making and their thinking. And I actually think it's like, in a way, really the artistic identity is like more critical than the work, like what it means to be an artist in culture. Like it's so essential, and especially now in the world that we live in, and like that hearing from artists is like part of learning the work, but it does take like an extra reach, and it does take, support structures for it. And like, but I will say that I do try, like with every show that I do, to like create some other trail of like information seeping. So like through, I'm really into ephemera, like just creating posters or like zines or anything, or like doing an interview, like anything, even if it's just online, like generating another point of access that like humanizes the work and creates like a more intimate pathway with audience. And I prefer the term audience over viewer. So I'm using that word primarily because I think that some people don't necessarily view in the same way, but also like not all work is viewable. Like there's other ways of encountering artistic experience. So but it is always a dilemma, and like there's always part of your voice, is not there. And it's also, I also want to like illuminate in that, like why Wendy's role as a writer and a critic is so absolutely essential. Like and oftentimes it's those voices that are like really making, I'm like tearing up, but like are making the primary contact between, maybe the visual experience or like the artistic encounter, and more deeply bonding with the work.
Thank you, Fawn. That was really beautiful. Thank you for the appreciation, because yeah.
I appreciate it so much, and seeing art as a dialogue, as a conversation, as speaking of layers, like many layers of ways of interacting with work, from children coming to the museum and doing workshops to, conceptual thinkers writing about the philosophical aspects, to craftspeople, to, popular culture people. And like the work can function on all these different levels. So, and I think Fawn and I, or I can speak for myself, I'm interested in it functioning on all these levels. And I'm interested in not limiting what it can mean, and instead inviting new perspectives on what it can mean, and having like a back and forth. Not only what do we think, but what's your experience in the museum? I actually really want. I feel like, because if I make work and I don't know what people think, then I'm kind of like talking to myself, So, which kind of is how this feels, because it's in Vermont. But this Zoom has been amazing, especially the questions. And I think, we should maybe schedule another Zoom sometime where we just talk with people about.
We have a meta Zoom.
Yeah.
You send in questions or something. Yeah.
Yeah, keep the questions coming. I wonder, Wendy, is it okay if I put you on the spot for a second and ask you to respond to that question about the kind of like the viewer, the visitor, the audience's takeaway, and what you've seen in your role as somebody who is kind of an interpreter or a,
Sure.
I'm interested in that.
Well, I will say, like, I don't do a huge amount of curating these days. So my experiences as a curator, I think, are much more limited than my role as somebody who is in that like first responder role, I guess, to art. And yeah, I guess the way I'll tilt the question to my experience is thinking about how I approach work. And I did a workshop a couple months ago with a group of emerging artists, and it was about that. It was essentially like a short workshop about them writing about their work. And one question that I always get asked is, like, as a critic, does it even matter what is on the press release of my show? Like, do you even read it? What is the, what kind of, not necessarily what is your research process, but like, do these kinds of didactics, does this matter? And for me, I feel like I want to understand something about the artist's intention when I'm approaching the work. I want to understand what the artist has set out to do. And one of my teachers in grad school, who I know Fawn knows as well, Michael Brenson, I think he said something like you should always be trying to like evaluate the work on its own terms. And so there is something important for me to understand something about how the artist like sets the terms for themselves, which often does come. I as I said, like, if there's a press release, I will read it. I think that an intention can also announce itself in the materiality of the thing itself. As a writer, I think what's interesting is I was trained as a curator, and something I found that was very different from like curatorial writing, or like the writing we did in like the M.A. curatorial program, versus what I was actually having to do as a critic, is I noticed that there was a lot more describing work that was necessary. And I think sometimes like curators, and maybe even sometimes artists themselves, are like, they're so close to the thing and they are so intimately entwined with the act of making, that when it comes to like communicating something about the work, that like this kind of descriptive work gets lost. And then I think it is important as a critic to give some sense of like, what are you looking at or experiencing, and like the description of that and the analysis of that. I'm a very ideas oriented person, so it like I like to try to have it never rest just in the level of like formal description, but like using language as a tool to describe. There's something really powerful about even like just describing like how are you approaching it in space. And when I mean, I don't do this that much in my writing now, but like I remember when I was also first starting to write reviews, I was really inspired by this text by I think she's Turkish curator Iri Rogoff. She wrote a text called like How to Dress for an Exhibition. It was about Thelma Golden's very important exhibition that she curated at the Whitney Museum called Black Male. And it was as much about the show as the people who were coming to the museum, like the audience. The way that this show brought a whole new viewership to a body of work and to like a set of ideas, and thinking about this question of a racialization of an audience, like a sociology of an exhibition. And I'm super interested in like those kinds of questions as well. Yeah. I kind of lost steam at the end there.
Yeah.
But
It's been a long day. Thank you all so much. I think that's maybe a good place to leave it. Before we go, I just want to obviously put in a plug for the show. So if you all happen to be in the Brattleboro area, or no, come to the Brattleboro area so that you can come to the museum and see Homebodies in person. The museum is open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Admission is free, and the exhibit is up through March 9th. And a particularly good time to visit would be on Saturday, March 2nd, when Fawn and Anna Huff will be premiering a new performance video piece here in Brattleboro at a great venue right up the street from the museum called Epsilon Spires. And you can read more about that performance and purchase tickets at brattleboromuseum.org. And finally, if you enjoyed tonight's event and would like to make a donation to support this type of free programming, or even become a member of the museum, we'd be very grateful for that. And you can do that also at our website, brattleboromuseum.org, under support. I'd like to thank David and Fawn for being such amazing collaborators, and for thinking and feeling so deeply about their work. This has been such a wonderful process, and I'm so grateful to both of you, and to Wendy for working with us for now months on this talk. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you involved.
thank you.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you sometime, I hope in person. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight, and have a lovely night. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.